table when you want to see a closer picture. But it's amazing the architectural detail. If you have a camera that you can take it. I didn't even realize this is above Dr. Westling's office. But this is taken by Deb Dinkelman, and she won last month because she sent in the best pictures, I guess. So, and I'm not the judge, so can't blame me.
So those of you who are friends of the library, put your cards in, and someone gets to win 4 of Jackie Mashek's fantastic kolaches, and some of them were made today, so they're fresh.
I never looked.
Sandy Hutchinson, woo!
Yes. Wherever Sandy is, there she is, right over there. Okay.
Okay. If you can grab a seat so we can get started. While we're waiting for people to get seated, would you please look at your phone and put it on vibrate or turn it off so it doesn't interrupt the program. As you know, there's nothing worse than a phone ringing in the middle of a program. One of the nice things about this program is that it is being filmed by the Butler County Historical Society, so that is another reason that we don't want phones ringing. In 1873, the early settlers of Butler County wisely voted that the county seat should be centrally located, and David City was born. If not for the towns of Butler County, David City would not exist. That is why we are celebrating the county seat of David City's 150th anniversary with these programs about the 12 incorporated towns of Butler County. It is because of these towns that David City has thrived. The presenters of this series are people who live in and are proud of their towns. We owe them our thanks for creating and presenting these programs. Giving a program like this is not easy. Those who have given it before can tell you that. We ask that you silence your cell phones for the duration of the program, and please hold your questions until the end of the presentation when we will open the floor for questions. And now, please welcome with me Carol and Carroll Krivanek, who will share the history of the community of Abie.
Testing 1, 2. Can everybody hear? Okay, I want to welcome everybody to the event center tonight. For those of you who don't know, Vita me vas means we welcome you. We have a little polka music playing in the background. It was from our favorite town polka guy, Ernie Kuchera. Ernie and Millie were Sharon's and my neighbors all our lives. When we got married, we bought the lot where we built our house from them. Ernie was a great neighbor. He was a gardener, and he always raised sweet corn. And he'd call and say, "You guys want sweet corn?" "Sure." Most people, they brought you sweet corn, you had to clean it and everything. Not Ernie. When he brought you sweet corn, it was clean. It was ready to put in the pot. That was just the way Ernie was. He was a great guy. And he'd been happy to see some of you guys enjoying a people here tonight while you're watching this presentation. My wife and I are both 72 years old. We have lived in Abie our entire life. I know pretty much every nook and cranny in town, and probably some nooks and crannies I shouldn't have known when I was a little kid. I've always listened to my dad for history and my grandparents for history. Sharon was born by Linwood on a farm on Indian Hill, and she used to go in the pasture and hunt for Indian artifacts, some of which she still has. She attended St. Mary's Catholic Church in Linwood until 1969 when they closed. And Linwood, they didn't have any of the sacraments in Linwood at the church. They were all in Abie, so she was very familiar with Abie, and when Linwood closed, she became a member of Abie's parish. Her elementary school years were spent in Nymburk, and after she graduated in 8th grade, the Nymburk school closed. All 4 sides of our families immigrated from Czechoslovakia, now known as the Czech Republic. With our upbringing comes a lot of tradition and pride. There's not a lot of documentation on Abie, but our presentation is really based on a few publications. There's some church publications and the Historical Society information. A 1937 Abie High School student project that was directed by their teacher, Ray Shorney, and also an affidavit that Emil Koronek, who was the teacher in Abie in 1944, put together. Those were very helpful in putting all this together. There was also an architectural preservation study book that we went by. This was back in 1983. My wife actually contacted these people back then about preserving our false storefronts in town, but they did this study, but it was deemed impossible to do. It just wasn't affordable because there was no grant money available at that time. We've also done research in the town board minutes since 1905, so there's really some interesting information in there. We also have a lot of experiences of our family members and our own personal experiences. We've always collected Abie memorabilia. Some has been passed down from our family and friends. Some has been obtained by attending auctions and of course the internet. It'd be impossible to name all the individuals that were represented in the development of Abie over the years, because one thing about Abie, there was an unbelievable amount of different people running businesses. Seems like businesses changed hands yearly in town. We received many calls excited about stories about Abie, and we shared in their excitement, but with the time element, we really couldn't put a lot of these things in our story. So we will try to depict the history of Abie to the best of our ability. So here we go. The earliest residents of the area were groups of woodland culture Indians who primarily were gatherers and hunters. They used bone and stone tools and constructed simple dwellings. The evidence of these people was made in an archaeological site along the Skull Creek that's referred to as Abie Deep Site, and the time frame was between 500 and 900 AD when these people were here. Following the Civil War, our young country was beginning with the journey to recovery. The westward movement was in progress, but it was put on hold by the war. Prior to the war, Nebraska prairie lands were described as the great vast desert, uninhabitable for humans. After the war, the westward movement resumed and thousands of immigrants were heading west. Most of them were Yankees and those of German descent. They first settled in the hills, but the Germans didn't like the poor land and the hilly terrain, so they moved to level ground. Then with the Homestead Act of 1862, a lot of settlers were drawn to Nebraska. In Nebraska, you could get 160 acres of land for a $14 filing fee, and you had to live on the land for 5 years. Then in 1873, another act allowed 160 more acres if you planted 10 acres into trees and tended them for 8 years. The Czechs were mainly agricultural people attracted to the fertile soil of the area. In research, we found that the Czech immigrants first went to Linwood, but then they decided on Abie because the hills reminded them of their home country. In 1869, a wagon train with 13 families arrived at the Rolling Hills, or Bohemian Alps as they referred to them as, which were reminiscent of their own country. They first settled at a site along Skull Creek that was about 1.5 miles north of Abie, but then they had a feeling that they needed to be closer to God, so they wanted to move on top of the hill, so that's why they chose the site on top of the hill by where the existing Catholic cemetery is now. Abie's often referred to as a hamlet, and this is because that was a phrase that they brought from the old country. That's what they called their little towns in the old country. Sharon and I have many artifacts after our family members who came across as immigrants. Sharon has a trunk that was brought over by her great-grandmother from Czechoslovakia. And I have a pie pack cabinet that my great-grandmother brought over from Czechoslovakia when she was a little girl. I was fortunate growing up in the cultural environment of Abie because I knew all the families. In fact, when I was a little kid, I mowed a whole bunch of lawns in town. I charged $1 a piece. That was my money-making project, so I knew all the little old ladies. They were happy to see me come, give me $1, and their grass was cut. Many of you also share the same kind of family history. Time to head to Abie and our journey together tonight. Despite all the relocating, according to all records, Abie is 154 years old now. The third time is a charm, and that is what it took for Abie to be located at its current location. The Czech pioneers arrived with a deep Catholic tradition which became vital to the development of Abie. The development of Abie and the church are highly meshed together. Prior to the first church being built, masses were held in people's homes, and a priest rode on horseback from Fremont to do the services. The pioneers wanted a priest of their own nationality, so in 1876, Reverend Joseph Hruska was summoned from Czechoslovakia. When he arrived, it meant that they needed to organize a parish, build a building, and honor St. Peter and Paul. The first church building was built in 1876. It cost $1,600, and it served 120 families. It was deemed too small by 1890, so a larger church was built in 1893. It was a bit south of the original church, but still by the cemetery. It cost $5,000 to build. Unfortunately, that church burned to the ground in 1918. The cause of the fire was speculated to be a candle that was left lit from a wedding that was held there the day before. The major name in the early days of Abie and the church was Joseph Sharon family. They lived on a farm about 3 miles north of Abie. They had 7 children. 5 of the 7 children entered religious vocations. We talked to a current family member from the Shankas who lives in Wisconsin now, and she told us that her great-grandfather helped build the first church, and he also helped build the first school that was in the area. The third church building was built in 1918 at a cost of $30,000, but it was moved approximately 3/4 of a mile to the south to its present location in Abie. And this is basically how the church looks today since the last remodel. This church holds the honor of being the first Czech Catholic church in the state of Nebraska. To this day, it is a generational stronghold in the community, still attracting new members from outside the Abie area. These are ribbons that were used in the church for various celebrations and different events. A lot of it's in Czech, and I really haven't been able to read most of it, so. The rectory in the early pictures was moved to Abie from the original site of Abie by the cemetery, and is still currently standing, albeit in kind of bad condition. These are pictures of the Golden Jubilee procession in Abie in 1926. There's a lot of people in Abie. The Catholic cemetery was established in 1877 at its current location. A German Lutheran farmer by the last name of Wahlberg, whose wife was a devout Catholic, donated 10 acres of land for the cemetery and then sold the church another 10 acres for $5 an acre with the promise that he would be allowed to be buried by his wife in the cemetery. This church holds many memories for most of us. Sharon's parents were married in it, Sharon and I were married in it, and our daughter was married in it. The second cemetery is the Bohemian National Cemetery. They purchased the land for it in 1888, and it was officially platted and founded in 1890 in its current location. I've been the chairman of the cemetery board for 44 years, following my dad and my grandpa. Some of the grave sites on this cemetery are so old that the word Neznami is in the record book, which means they're unknowns. Nobody really knows who's buried there, but they know somebody is. On many you will see the word otec for father and matka for mother. A good friend of mine, who wasn't a Czech, talked to me one day and he said, boy, that otec's name is popular in Butler County. there's every cemetery has otec's family in it. I didn't have the nerve, well, I did have the nerve. I kind of laughed at him. I told him he has to be a Czech, but I said that means those were dad and father and mother. During this time, before the church, so to speak, during this period of time, before the church, so to speak, settled down in one spot, the railroad arrived in 1887, and it brought a lot of changes to the area. First thing they did is they built a depot and stockyards by the railroad, which ran on level ground along Skull Creek for ease of construction. Even though businesses such as the general store, blacksmith shop, and a lodge hall were built in 1879 at the original site where the church was located, the final move for Abie and the church went to its current location because of accessibility to the railroad. The railroad chose their site close to the creek on the west side of Abie because of the level ground. There was even a train derailment north of Abie in the late 40s or early 50s. The railroad, sadly, was officially abandoned in 1962. The railroad ties that were being removed but still laying on the right-of-way contributed to much damage during the big flood of 1963. Us kids in town were all saddened when the railroad closed because we used to walk the railroad track for miles to go to our favorite fishing hole in Skull Creek. An interesting fact to me is the big flood in Abie, Linwood area was on June 23rd of 1963. Then exactly 20 years later, on June 23rd of 1983, we had the big fire in the elevator in Abie. In the early days of the railroad, when I was a little kid, I remembered that the hobos would come to town with the railroad. It would usually, the same ones came every year. People knew them by them, and they fed them. There was the same gent always came to my folks' place. He brought his little knapsack and he slept on the porch. Did that every year, didn't bother anybody. Now here's a couple early pictures of Abie Main Street. They aren't real clear, but that's about the best we could do. One interesting fact about Abie in the early days was an attempt to incorporate the town, even though there were not enough residents to do so. There's an actual court document to verify this. The current town site was platted originally for 80 acres by the Pioneer Town Site Company, who was organized by a group of individuals, Ojidil, Hurt, Datil, Vovozil, and so forth. But these men got themselves in a bunch of trouble. In 1893, these 5 men were claiming 200 residents in town when there actually were 70. Law at that time required that you have 200 residents to incorporate the town. So what they did is they presented a false petition to the state. They had individuals that didn't live in town sign the petition, and they even copied some signatures off of another town's petition to get to 200. Well, the state wasn't very fond of that procedure, so I never did read what kind of punishment they got or if they got punished, but anyhow, the incorporation was done. They couldn't do it. And the funny part was, this whole deal was because Mr. Uriel, who's on the town board, or the actual false town board, he wanted to open a bar in town, and he wanted a liquor license. And in order to have a liquor license, you had to be incorporated. So it was kind of a, they took money for permits, and they put the money in their own pockets, so they really kind of goofed things up. So this is kind of a map of the early businesses in Abie, around 1904. So in 1904, all this rigmarole about the incorporation had kind of settled down, and there was actually 200 people living in town. So they were able to get incorporated, they were able to hold a legal village board election, and they were actually legally able to issue licenses. In that year, it struck me as real funny, the election for the board in 1904 was held in the pool hall. Years later, pool house had to be closed on election day, so things have changed, I guess. 2 bars opened in Abie in 1905 when the liquor license cost $525. Yeah. This is a picture of one of the earliest businesses in the current town of Abie that was built there, and it was still actually in business in 1904. Usually when you bring liquor to town, you need a marshal and a jail. So in 1905, they built the first jail. It was 12 foot by 14 foot by 7 foot high. Imagine that now. At one time, my dad was the village marshal. Even in 1906, after things had seemingly settled down, 3 of the 5 new village board members resigned. So there still must have been something going on. Can't find what it was, but sounding like the Wild West, the first ordinance book arrived in 1907. Some of the kind of funny, some maybe not too funny, but some of the new ordinances that I read were no children under 16 were allowed to be outside after 8 p.m. Dog licenses were $1 for a male dog and $2 for a female dog. So that kind of proves the value of females, right? They, in 1913, the village board authorized installing speed limit signs. I believe the automobile came out in roughly 1907, so I kind of wonder how many cars were really driving around Abie at that time, or if the horses were going too fast. Kind of a odd thing that I found was the village ordinance stated that dogs running at large, any citizen who shot a stray dog would receive $2 from the village. That's pretty sad, right? That's what I'm saying, things were a little different back then. In 1916, one of the issues for the town board was somebody had a chicken house in front of their residence. They didn't like that, so he was forced to move it from the front to the back. So I guess maybe it looked better and smelled better in the back, I don't know. In 1918, the pool halls and soft drink parlors were to close at 11 p.m. Makes me wonder, were they spiking the soft drinks at the parlors? I don't know. Also jumping forward to 1958, the village paid a farmer $20 a year to allow the citizens to dump all their garbage in his ravine right by the road. Now that's how things have changed. Okay, from 1887 through 1920s, Abie experienced a big growth spurt. There's a saying that says it takes a village to raise a child. It also takes a school, and the Abie School was the first Abie School was built in 1873. Mathieu Pavel was sent to Fremont with his team of oxen and wagon to pick up benches for the new school. And the documents I read state that Mr. Pavel nearly lost his life because when he was coming home from Fremont, a blizzard approached, and he was caught in the blizzard with his team of oxen, and the only thing that saved him was he stumbled upon an old sod house and was able to shelter there till the storm was over. One of those old benches from the first school was put in Fronta's Tavern in 1937. And sure would be nice to know where that went. I'm sure it got destroyed, but In 1896, attendance at the school was registered 97 pupils, with an average daily attendance of 73. The second school was opened in 1905, with the first school building being moved elsewhere in Abie and used as a residence. I attended elementary school in that building, and it maintained its stoker-type furnace until it was dismantled. The coal for the furnace was brought in by a railroad car, and if I'm not mistaken, it took 3 railroad cars of coal to heat the school for one winter. The coal was shoveled onto trucks. My grandfather had the truck, and then they had to go to school and shovel it back off to down in the basement. But then years later, someone got a new truck that had a hoist on it, so that made the operation about half as hard. They were able to raise it up and just let it slide into the basement. The high school closed in 1946. In 1950, a polio benefit basketball game was held between the midgets and the giants. The kids defeated the parents handily. And this is a picture of a mural that was painted by some of the last students to go to Abie to school. It was kind of an art project of theirs, and it's hanging in Abie's place now so everybody can see it. The final and present building was erected in 1968, and the school closed in 2006. In 2008, Abie's Place took possession of the building and opened the bar and restaurant. Charles Stevens, who was also referred to as a Yankee, started the first post office in his general store in 1878. At that time, if you weren't a Czech, you were a Yankee. Just how it was. Abie was named after his wife, Abigail Van Stevens. Ironic to me that the post office was named after a woman when women in Nebraska could not even vote until 1920. In 1904, a building was constructed which housed a residence, a post office, a switchboard, and a confectionery at various times. The picture on the screen is an actual postcard of John Hussik in 1905, who was the first rural carrier from Abie. He made a 50-mile round trip a day. They always say neither rain nor snow nor heat stopped the mail, and I believe that was probably the case, unlike now when 2 snow flurries and the mail's late. To me, these were kind of interesting. Couple pictures of American Express travelers checks that were paid to the village back in 1912. I guess I didn't realize American Express company was in business that long, but people used them even back then. In 1935, the Abie postal route was consolidated with the Linwood route, and that was the end of the Abie route. In 1936, the post office moved to the former ZCBJ Hall. Once again on the move, the post office moved to the former bank building when it closed in 1956. At that time, the bank was called the Abie Co-op Credit Association. First it was the Abie State Bank, and then it became, I think it kind of slowed down during the Depression, and then it became Abie Cooperative Credit Association. As the post office hours decreased, its final location was made to the fire hall. When the lady that had the contract at the post office decided it was time for her to retire, the post office refused to issue a contract to another person, so they closed our post office in 2019. However, the lucky part was we were able to retain the Abie address and the first zip code in the state of Nebraska at 68001. So now we have cluster boxes, but at least we have our old address. As you can see, a lot of things in Abie had trouble settling down. The Abie Milling Company was built in 1905. In 1914, the village board had to issue an order for them to raise the height of their smokestack because it filled the town with smoke. The mill was known far and wide for its high quality flour. By 1937, it was marketed in Omaha, Fremont, Schuyler, Howells, Prague, and many other towns in eastern Nebraska. The mill made white lily flour, which was its white flour, Swoboda was its rye flour, and Graham was its wheat flour. The mill closed for good in 1945. In the early years, the mill provided power to the town before 1921. In 1920, the Blue River Power Company approached the town about getting electricity into town, and the town spent $4,500 to build a line into town, and then on January 1st of 1921, anybody in town could hook onto the power. So they finally had their own source of electricity. In 1911, Village Pride saw a 56-foot flagpole erected in the middle of Main Street. In 1907, surprisingly, Abie had its own mortuary that was run by Swoboda. Rada's General Store was next to the mortuary, but burned down in the 30s. For those of you who remember, free shows were later held on this lot, and now a pump house stands there. Joe Jenny from Malmo was well known providing the free outdoor movies that had a popcorn machine and refreshments during the free shows. Czechs always liked music, and here's a few pictures of some of the bands from Abie. First one is the Early Town Band that's in front of the old parish hall. The next one is the town band started by the Shemerkin Swoboda in front of the ZCBJ Hall in 1920. And then the final one is the Abie Booster Band. Back in the day, these booster bands traveled from town to advertise events that were going on in town. They were kind of a traveling advertisement group. In 1908, the village board discussed installing a waterworks system and then purchased a lot with the anticipation of building it on that lot. The main reason for this was concerns about neglected and poorly maintained outdoor privies. Then in 1910, they contacted another company about it, and finally it was decided that it just wasn't feasible to build a water system at that time. So they built a new city hall on that lot in 1912. After these attempts, it wasn't until 1931 when they held another election and it was decided it was time to put a waterworks system in Abie. They voted a special election on a bond issue for $8,500, which passed 67 to 16 to build the water system. So in 1932, the water system was built. And it cost $10,600 for the whole water system. Well, pump, water tower, and all the mains. Unbelievable, right? There have been 4 different wells in Abie since then. 2 of them are still active. In 1981, a community development block grant for nearly $300,000 was received to construct a new water well and replace some of the old water mains. Then in 1986, the village received a USDA grant loan for nearly $300,000 for the construction of the first ever sewer system in town. And that made a lot of people happy. Out of necessity, a group of volunteers organized a volunteer firefighters organization in 1910. Their first equipment was 3 ladders on a cart made by the local blacksmith and was pulled by the men to the scene of the fire. In 1912, a chemical fire engine was purchased for $450. And officially in 1913, the Abie Village Board made a resolution declaring the Abie Fire Company official. In 1946, Abie bought their first motorized fire truck, motorized pumper truck. And the first fire that they used that truck on was at the St. Mary's Church in Linwood. Lightning struck the steeple and caught on fire in Linwood. Linwood's chemical truck didn't have enough pressure to reach up to the steeple, but Abie's pumper truck could, and they put the steeple out and saved the church. By the way, in 1946, the fire department charged $750 for a rural fire call. A second truck was added 5 years later, and since then have been updated many times. The Dodge fire truck was always serviced at the service station that my grandfather owned, and of course that's me in front of the truck. I can never miss out on riding in the fire truck from the fire hall to the station. Then in 1954, W.J. Fronta purchased the old fire bell from the fire hall when an electric siren was installed. The current fire hall was built in 1975 and housed the fire department, and then in 1986 it was added on to make its current configuration. Recently, Abie and Bruno fire departments have merged to become the Skull Creek Volunteer Fire Department. My grandfather, my father, and I all joined the fire department over the years. I started when I was 16 and became fire chief in 1979. Following my father's footsteps, and finally stepped down from fire chief in 2019 after 40 years. I still remain active if they need my help. Adding to the growth popularity, in 1905, the village board authorized the streets to be widened and wooden sidewalks built along the streets. But then in 1910, they decided that wooden sidewalks weren't a good idea, so they had to be replaced by brick or cement. In 1912, the first street lights were installed in Abie. The power for them was provided by the Abie Milling Company. The street lights were only supposed to be lit from sunset to 11 p.m. They also decided they needed new rules. No lights were to be lit if there was a full moon. I guess that was better for all the kids to be speeding on the street, I don't know. Then later, authorization was given that the streetlights could be on till 2 a.m. in the morning if there was a dance or a celebration in town. Evidently, it took a little while to get all the people out of town safely. History states that the highest population of Abie was 210 people in 1910. In 1917, Registration Day was declared by the federal government. It meant that all men 21 years of age and older were to register for the draft as the U.S. was becoming involved in World War I. People in that day were very proud and honored to serve their country, and as seen in these pictures, Abie held a celebration for Registration Day. Another fact that I had to check several times was in 1920, the tax levy for the city of Abie was 40 mills. Currently, it's less than 2. So they, didn't have the valuation, so they had to have a high tax levy. Now, I think we're gonna see some pictures. Okay, this, in the beginning, evidently bars weren't owned as much by individuals as they were owned by breweries. If you look close, this bar was owned by the Fremont Brewery, and the Storrs Brewery owned the bar across the street. This is Mr. Boslowski. He come to town once a week with his cart full of live chickens and sold it to the citizens. This is the first elevator that was built in Abie. This picture is early Mushek blacksmith working on a corn sheller in 1915. This is a picture of tractors parked on Main Street in 1927. If you can believe it, there was a car dealership in Abie in the 20s. There's some of the early cars that were on the streets of Abie, and there's more of the early cars that were on the streets of Abie. This depicts farmers as they brought their tractors to town and were waiting at Mushek Brothers to have them serviced in the late 20s. This is the city garage, was built in 1917. It still stands today. Stanley Novak, who lived about 3 miles out of town, came to Abie once a week with his horse and buggy to get supplies and of course a drink at the bar. I remember him very clearly. He passed away in 1962. This is Mushek's garage after a pretty good snowstorm by the looks of the picture. And this is one of the few buildings that still stands on Main Street at Abie. And this is the inside of Mushek's hardware store in 1915. In 1923, the church purchased property in the village, which was a former dance hall. It was used for many community events, such as in 1937, a play was held there with all locals being the actors, and the name of the play was When a Woman Decides. Somehow I'd like to know the answer. In the hall, they held their yearly, they called it a pote. It was a big dinner they held at the church every year. And Sharon and I both remember standing in lines clear down the main street of Abie waiting to eat when we were little kids. An article in the Butler County Press from 1939 said the adult meal at the pote that year was a chicken dinner for 25 cents. My kindergarten school program was held in this hall on the stage. It was sold in the mid-60s when the church basement was totally finished, and they figured they were going to hold their church dinner in the church hall instead of in this hall. The Rowe family purchased the hall and turned it into a machine storage shed. I worked for the Rowes at that time and helped them tear down the south portion, which had been a bar years before, but at that time was the kitchen of the parish hall. Over the years, it became too small for their use and fell to disrepair. Last year, Sharon and I gained possession of the property and had the remainder of the hall removed. There still is the old ice house foundation was still there by the hall where they got ice for the two businesses that previously had been in the hall. Now we're going to show you some pictures of some various collectibles that Sharon and I have accumulated over the years. This is just in our house where we have our stuff displayed. And then this is F.J. Rowe, who was he was a general merchandise store. Then A.J. Bohar, he was a general merchandise store. He was in the building as a predecessor to the Abie Mercantile Company. And this is the inside of Mushek hardware store. J.J. Matos sold clothes in Abie. Then a couple of advertising calendars from Mushek Brothers. And this is a little coin purse thing from Mushek Brothers. Then this is a tractor umbrella that actually my dad and his dad received from Mushek Brothers when they bought their tractor from Mushek. In the picture there, you saw a big wooden toolbox that said Mushek Brothers on it, and that also was something they gave you when they bought the big steam engine tractor from Mushek's. So they gave you this whole big toolbox of tools. And that was about World War II vintage calendar from Mushek Implement. And this was another Mushek advertising piece. Mushek was a very prominent business in Abie. This is Rada's General Store. I just thought it was interesting because they sold Kroll brand overalls. Chandra must have been basically a bar. A couple different sayings on the back of it, kind of funny. And Blaha was a barber, but he sold soft drinks. Ed Krink had a lumberyard grain elevator, sold coal. He's actually my wife's grandfather. This is the inside of Okrina's butcher shop. I remember going in there with my dad, and it had a certain smell in there because he was always making sausage and stuff, and he'd take you in the back room where he did all the grinding and processing, and he'd show you what he was making new that day, and it always amazed me, and I can relate because I saw those carcasses hanging in the front of the butcher shop when you walked in the door. Had the carcasses hanging there, so. This is the inside of Abie Mercantile Company, as is that. just an advertising piece of theirs, a couple match tins that they put out. AJ Fronta had a pool hall, I guess they called it in Abie. And then WJ Fronta must have had another pool hall, I guess. And this is a picture of the inside of the bar that was to the south of the parish hall initially. There's a few names on there of some of the people, but I couldn't get all the names. Okay, Suckle Auditorium. It was built in 1923 by the Suckle Gymnastic Group. The town actually had to vacate 6 feet of the alley behind the building because they wanted a certain size and there wasn't enough room for it, so the town vacated part of the alley so the building could be built. The hooks in the ceiling from all their gymnastic equipment are still in the ceiling of the hall today. In 1950, a polio benefit play was held there, once again with all local actors, and the name of it was Nazami Pivovar, which the best I can translate was in our brewery. Imagine Czechs would have something to do with beer in the play. From the 40s to 1951, the fire department rented the hall from the Suckle group to hold dances and community events as a money-making venture. The Suckles always maintained ownership of the hall even though they no longer used it. At that point, after 1951, a group of local men, one of them being my dad, remodeled the hall to be used for community events and stuff. They even built square tables by hand to be used in the basement. And in 1942, Ernie Kutsha formed his band. He was always known as Nebraska's #1 polka band, so we're kind of always proud of that. Along with Ernie Kutsha, other big name groups that played at the Abie Auditorium were Lawrence Welk, Six Fat Dutchman, Paul Moorhead, Duffy Bellrod, and many other names. Of course, me being the shadow I was to my dad, I was in on all the excitement at these dances. Since my grandfather and my father were both on the village board, I followed suit and have been treasurer of the village for 48 years. In 1991, a fire occurred in the hall caused by a faulty beer cooler. Unfortunately, there was no private insurance held by the Suckles, so they weren't able to repair the hall, but they did agree to gift it to the village. It took 3 years to repair and lots of donations and free labor, but the village was able to reopen it in 1994 with a dance on October 16th. Then, in 1996, a windstorm hit the hall and took the whole roof off. But luckily at that time, the village had insurance on the hall, so we were able to have it fixed and got it back running a year later in 1997. A lot of music ran out of that hall over the years, including our wedding dance and my daughter's wedding dance. That was in 2005. Despite being from the big city now, she insisted when she got married on having a traditional Czech wedding, including the old Baba and Doda that walked around for crib money. And we had a lot of out-of-town people that were never at a Czech wedding. So they were all fascinated by the way Czechs put on a wedding. So those kind of good times, it's hard to imagine the hall is pretty much done because the hall had to be closed in 2017. We get a lot of inquiries why we had to close it, but basically it was because of finances. The hall was costing more money to just try to keep heated than we actually generated in taxes from the town for the year. And there was a lot of other things in town needed to be taken care of that needed tax money, and we couldn't put it all into keeping the hall warm. It's a shame, but I guess that's progress, right? Not really, but this building still attracts attention. In October of 2022, an architectural and Czech language student group from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln came to Butler County to tour some towns. They toured Dwight Brainerd and then Abie. The reason being they were studying the culture of the Czech settlements and the architecture of the old buildings in the towns. They were mostly interested in the Sokol Hall in Abie, the church, and some of the old houses that were still existing in Abie. The tour group ended at Abie's place for a traditional Czech meal of roast pork, dumplings, and sauerkraut. And then one of the ladies there had an accordion, so they were learning to try and do the polka. They were having a good time, so. Now I'm going to talk about some unknown aspects of Abie, which many towns can probably relate to. Needless to say, the information we have of all the transition individuals could fill a big book, but we can't say it all, but I'll just try to hit some highlights. My wife always has planned on writing a book about the village of Abie because she's accumulated all kinds of different publications with information, but hopefully maybe someday she'll get to it. In 1926, the Abie had a ball team, as many towns did. Couldn't find any pictures of it, but in 1926, Abie lost to Wahoo 4-0, so. In 1930s, Abie had a dentist by the name of Motes. In the summer of 1934, the town held its first celebration. Some interesting facts about the celebration are that in 1944, the village board refused to allow the carnival to have the girly show, Hoopala. In 1945, the free act of the 3 flying meteors was presented free to the people at a cost of $150 to the town. Mr. Lavitsky, in his presentation on Dwight, talked about that after the Czechs arrived, the beer consumption increased in Dwight. Well, in the 1945 Carnival dance in Abie, there was 857 tickets sold at the hall and 250 cases of beer drank. They were sold for 18 cents a bottle. You gotta watch them Czechs when you mix polka and beer. In 1947, the free show at the celebration was Colonel Wilbur. I couldn't come up with any information about what Colonel Wilbur did, but they paid him $300 to perform his act, so I'm thinking it had to be something fairly spectacular. Also in 1947, the girly show for the carnival was approved. I guess the board had a change in mind, I guess. 1954 celebration, this is a flyer from the 1954 celebration for the 85th anniversary of Abie. In 1956 at the celebration, they decided to have car races. I think they called them car demolition races or something. If I recollect right, they were just running around in a circle, okay? But they parked them all on Main Street so that people could see them. And they kind of lined up and had a good time with it. I think these pictures show running around and then some of the damage. This car was sponsored by the auditorium. And this one was sponsored by Linwood. This one, I believe, was, if I read it correctly, was sponsored by Johnson Garage, which I think Reynold Johnson was the one who was kind of the instigator of these car races. And I think this is the remnants after the race was over. And this young man is standing by his uncle's car. I think he's in the audience tonight, and most all of you probably know him. That's Hruska Krivanek. I think they ran these car races for 2 years, but then they quit because I'm assuming they probably ran out of junk cars in the junkyard. 1964 marked the last carnival in Abie. The carnival to me was always the highlight of my year. Of course, I was with my dad all the time. The firemen are those who sponsored the celebrations. And my dad was fire chief, so he worked closely with the carnival crew to make sure all safety issues were dealt with in case the trucks had to leave town or something, so they wouldn't be blocked in. So, they always gave me a whole roll of free tickets to all the rides, so I rode all the time I could. So, in 1964, Sharon and I basically had our first date at the carnival in Abie. And we rode around on the Ferris wheel, and I convinced the guy running the Ferris wheel to stop with us clear on top and rock the seat, and my wife screamed her lungs out. She still brings that up every time we talk about it. Each year, a guy by the name of Billix came to Abie with the carnival. He usually came a few days to a week ahead of time, and he was a painter. He also ran one of the games at the carnival, but he was a freehand painter, and he painted all kinds of signs. This sign on the old post office was one of his signs that he painted, but he painted no parking signs for the town, he painted fire trucks, names on the doors and stuff, and he was just a real nice guy. He'd come early and that was his hobby. Now we have a few more advertising pieces. I'm hoping I'm not boring you with advertising pieces because they kind of represent the businesses better than what I can talk about. Back in the day, the same business was in a couple different towns. This business was both in Abie and Linwood. And this one was both in Abie and Bruno. The Saucony Vacuum Oil Company, which later became Mobile Oil Company, was run by W.J. Fronta. These calendars are from the 60s. Then in 1940, these pictures are from 1946, and they kind of depict the businesses that were still active in Abie in 1946. So, as you see, there was actually quite a few businesses still going in Abie at that time. Then this is my grandpa's mobile station and his trucking business. Yonda Hardware, who was the successor to Mushek Hardware. Slusser and Krivanek Tavern, which was my dad. And Fronta's Tavern. Friend Gladys Hodgick owned the tavern. And then everybody should know Ding and Marie's Tavern. Some interesting facts about Abie. My dad always told me that Senator Roman Hruska was born in Abie. I couldn't really find any information that verified that, so I wasn't going to say anything, but lo and behold, when we were setting up our display at the library with Sharon, they have a display about Roman Hruska in the library, and it states that his parents lived in Abie when he was born. So, I guess Roman Hruska was from Abie. Probably most well-known person from Abie. In the Abie High School basketball players won a state championship trophy back in the late 40s, early 50s. And Dr. Howard Fensel, who was a well-known physician in the area for years, was one of the members of that team. There was a trophy in the old trophy case in school, but we have no idea what happened to it, except we know what it said on it. As a youngster, some of the hijinks we did in Abie were, we always called the Belovich's store. We'd ask him if he had Prince Albert in the can. Some of you know the answer. If Jack said yes, we'd laugh and say, well, you better let him out. Old Jack was a pretty jovial guy, and we did that over and over to him, and he just laughed and went along with us every time we did it. When we were young kids, of course, many of you remember, pop bottles and beer bottles were worth some money. So we collected pop bottles. Well, we always took them to Fronta's Tavern for our money. Tony would give us the money, and when we left, he stored all his empty bottles in the back before the truck came to pick them up. So when we run out of bottles in the ditches in town, we snuck around the back of the bar and filled our wagons and come through the front door and sold the bottles again. Tony wasn't no fool. He knew darn well we were doing it. He just went along with it, was happy us guys were having fun. Charlie Swoboda was a bachelor that lived with his parents in Abie. He was kind of the Abie handyman. He ran the old generator, he blew the noon whistle, he ran the water pump, because back in the day, there were no electric controls on the water pump. You had to sit there and watch it pump water. So his little daily jobs kind of kept the town running. The house that he and his parents lived in is still standing in Abie, and it's still being lived in. Everyone in town knew Doc Wojda, the town veterinarian. Not sure if he ever had any kind of a degree, but if your animal was sick, you went to town and you picked him up, brought him to your farm, and he usually nursed the animal back to health. Everybody knew about Ding and Marie's. Their reputation was for their large ice cream cones and their fish fries. My dad fried fish there every Friday night. On warm summer nights, you could smell the frying fish and hear the chick music all over town. Halloween was another fun time for me. Day after Halloween, you got up and go see whose outhouse was tipped or put on somebody's roof, or whose buggy was on somebody's roof. Typical Saturday nights at the bar were also funny too, because there was always usually a car or two in the ditch near the bar because they couldn't find their way home. The Czechs always loved with their gaiety and dancing. In the early days of Abie, an outdoor platform was constructed for dancing, which was right northwest of town along the Skull Creek west of the railroad tracks. They had a generator to provide electricity for the platform, but my dad always told me the story that the gentleman that ran the generator was more interested in drinking beer than he was watching the generator. So usually the generator ran out of gas, the lights went out, to the delight of most of the young couples that were there. Eventually, floodwaters removed the platform. As you can see by this chart, the population in Abie fluctuated greatly over the years. This is what was left in town in 1983. And as of today, there's 3 main businesses left in Abie. Abie's Place, Krivanek Construction, and the Abie Vegetable People. But at least we have businesses left. In conclusion, growing up in Butler County means one is committed for life. Not because you have to, but because you truly care about the area. We're all connected and know a similar way of life. Sharon was beside herself when Greg, at the last presentation, mentioned his parents had dudki, which was a leather strap for parents to adjust kids' attitudes. Sharon's mom always kept a pair in her purse when they went to church. So, young Sharon had a solution to that. She threw him down the outdoor privy. She learned quickly that that wasn't going to work because her mom had another set. Sharon and I have been in many organizations. In a small Czech community, there can be a lot of heated discussions at meetings, but it seems like always after the meeting, everybody goes outside or to the bar, has a round of beer, and eventually they wind up laughing and talking together. They don't hold a grudge. A small Czech town is a great place to grow up and never leaves your heart. And as Sharon's grandma always said, when you left her place, spot in Bohem. In simple terms, it means Godspeed. Congratulations to our communities and 150 years of Butler County pride. We hope you enjoyed the tour through Abie. Thanks. Anybody have any questions? Don't know if I can answer them, but yes.
The general store that you showed that was first owned by Stevens, then was owned by Fadier.
Yeah.
Is that the one that then became the General Mercantile, Abie General Mercantile, the same store?
Yeah, there's so many owners of them businesses back in those years, it's amazing.
Yes.
A lot of them, I'm guessing a lot of them didn't last a year, and there was somebody else in there.
Or they re-owned it later.
Yeah, there's several businesses.
Yes.
The butcher shop was one, Oakland's butcher shop was one example. He sold it, he went through like about 4 other people, and then he bought it back and finally ran it till it closed.
Is that building still there?
No, that's been gone for a long time. Anybody else?
You said the railroad came in 1887?
1887.
How far, let's say 10 years prior to that, how far away was the railroad? Any idea?
The railroad came out of Seward. And I don't know, it came through B and Dwight Brainerd. I have no idea, how far it was, I'm sure it just didn't get built in 1 year. It progressed there slowly. Right, yeah. Yeah, it went all the way to Fremont, yeah. Until the,
And it went down to Superior.
down to Superior, yeah. But it went to Fremont until the Platte River washed the Platte River Bridge washed out in the 50s, and then it always turned around and went back. It never went through then. Any other questions? No? Yes, sir.
There was a railroad track when it went across Uncle John Bartzel's farm.
Yeah.
Is that the same one that it come through?
Well, there was actually 2 railroads that crossed each other right in the area of John Bartzel's. The one that came from Prague through Rescue, and then this one, they actually crossed right in that area of where John Bartzel's farm was.
When sometime in the 80s, the track, I think, was taken out in the 50s, if I'm not.
The track was taken out in 1963.
He asked his wife sometime in the 80s, have you noticed the train has gone by this?
Then it was good he was able to enjoy the train for more years than anybody else. Any other questions? No more questions? Thank you for your, go ahead.
How old is the church building now?
The church building now was built in 1918. Started in 1918. I believe it took about a year to build it, from what I read. Yeah, and it's still, there's not any cracks. I mean, it's really amazing the construction they did with the bricks back then. Anybody else? Yes?
Bernie Kuchar was known as #1 polka band. How many of his family members played? Like Frank was one.
Yeah, several of his brothers. In fact, the best guy to answer that question is sitting in my 2 rows behind you over there. I know a lot of his brothers. He actually, from what I read, he played in Frank's band first, and that's where he got his start as a musician, and then he decided he was going to have his own band. And I know, Johnny Kuchar had a band. Man, music is kind of in the Kuchar blood. Big part of Abie in the early days.
One interesting thing I found one day, I was looking on Facebook and I came across Ernie in a band playing somewhere, and one of the band members was introducing the band members, and they come to Ernie, and he had a funny comment, but you have to know that Ernie was number 17.
Yep, he was number 17, absolutely. Yep, there's 17 kids. Can you imagine the poor mother when she had to bake and cook for those 17? Anybody else? Well, no questions. Thanks again for everybody coming out.
Well, thank you, Carol and Sharon, for the wonderful program. And in thanks, the Butler County Historical Society wants to give you this token of appreciation. It's a year membership certificate to the Butler County Historical Society.
Great.
I have just a few other thank yous. Thank you to the Butler County Area Foundation for partial funding of the Towns of the County series. Sharon for running the slideshow tonight. Big hand for Sharon. To the Butler County Event Center staff and board for the use of this wonderful facility. We just keep growing and we appreciate so much being able to hold it here. Jackie Moshik for the delicious refreshments. The Friends of Hruska Public Library for supplying water. Cheryl for running the registration desk. Steve Barleen and Mark Doling for filming the program, which will be available. I think Mark's doing that. will be available on the Butler County Historical Society YouTube channel when completed, so you can watch this again. Judy Davis and Robert Polachek for manning the table selling Butler County Historical Society items, and they are back there. Gina for all the behind-the-scene work, and of course to all of you for coming out to support Butler County history. Thank you all.
And I just want to say one more thing, and that is that next month's program will be the 5th in the Towns of the County series, and it's featuring the history of surprise. And Mark Doling will be the presenter, and the date of the program is Monday, May 15th, so put that on your calendars. It'll be here at the Event Center again, and always starting at 6:30. Please stop at the registration desk on your way out to sign up for the presentation, because registrations help us know how many chairs to set up. There is a donation box available on the table as well, and if you're enjoying this series and would like to help with the expenses of putting it on, please consider donating, because every dollar helps. And thank you. Have a safe trip home.